Turkmenistan is frequently described as one of the most closed and tightly controlled countries in the modern world. And nowhere is this paradox more visually striking than in its capital, Ashgabat. At first glance, Ashgabat appears immaculate, almost unreal in its presentation. Vast boulevards stretch across the desert landscape, lined with symmetrical government buildings clad in white marble. Monumental fountains, grand palaces, sweeping plazas, and carefully manicured parks project an image of order, prosperity, and permanence. The city holds multiple world records for its use of white marble and for various monumental structures, reinforcing its reputation as a meticulously constructed showpiece. To an outside observer, Ashgabat can resemble a futuristic capital designed to symbolize national pride and stability. Yet beneath this pristine exterior, numerous reports from journalists, human rights observers, and former residents describe a starkly different reality, one defined by political repression, strict surveillance, restricted freedoms, and an atmosphere of pervasive control. Visitors often remark on the unusual quietness of the city. Despite its vast scale and grand architecture, central Ashgabat can feel sparsely populated. Streets appear unusually empty for a capital city, and public life seems subdued. The contrast between architectural grandeur and limited visible civic activity has fueled speculation that much of the city functions as a symbolic stage set rather than a fully lived urban space. Critics argue that enormous financial resources have been allocated to monumental construction projects while economic hardships persist among segments of the population. This dissonance between image and lived experience has led some analysts to frame Ashgabat as an example of political aesthetics and environment, deliberately designed to project strength and unity while discouraging scrutiny of internal governance. To understand how this dynamic developed, it is necessary to examine Turkmenistan's post-Soviet political evolution. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Turkmenistan emerged as an independent state. Saparmurat Niyazov, who had served as the head of the Turkmen Communist Party, transitioned seamlessly into the presidency of the new republic. While many former Soviet states experimented imperfectly and unevenly with pluralism and democratic reforms, Turkmenistan instead consolidated power around a single executive authority. The institutional framework inherited from the Soviet period, including security services and centralized administrative structures, remained largely intact. Over time, these mechanisms were adapted to reinforce presidential control. Under Niyazov's leadership, the state developed a highly centralized political system characterized by minimal opposition, limited independent media, and extensive surveillance. The former Soviet security apparatus was reconstituted under new institutional names, but retained similar operational methods. Observers have reported that telephone communications, travel permits, employment records, and educational institutions were subject to monitoring. Civil society organizations operated under strict regulation, and independent political activity was effectively absent. The concept of private space, particularly in matters of political expression, became increasingly constrained. One of the defining features of Niyazov's rule was the cultivation of an elaborate personality cult. Public spaces were filled with portraits and statues of the president. A rotating golden statue of Niyazov was installed in Ashgabat, designed to turn toward the sun throughout the day. Months of the year and days of the week were renamed in honor of the president and his family members. These symbolic gestures were not merely decorative. They functioned as psychological reinforcement of centralized authority. When a single leader's image dominates currency, textbooks, monuments, and broadcast media, that presence becomes normalized in everyday life. Over time, the repetition of symbols shapes perception, embedding the leader's identity into the fabric of national consciousness. Central to this symbolic project was a book authored by Niyazov called the Ruhnama. Presented as a spiritual and historical guide for the Turkmen people, the Ruhnama blended mythology, selective history, moral instruction, and autobiographical narrative. It was elevated to a status that extended far beyond typical political literature. The text became mandatory reading in schools and universities. Civil servants were required to demonstrate knowledge of its contents. Driver's license exams reportedly included questions based on the book. Even religious institutions incorporated references to it in sermons. The elevation of the Ruhnama to quasi-sacred status represented a deliberate attempt at identity construction. By shaping the narrative of national history and morality through a single authorized text, the state sought to define both the past and the acceptable boundaries of thought in the present. Information control extended beyond domestic publications. Foreign media access was heavily restricted. International news outlets faced significant barriers to entry. Internet access, while expanded over time, remained filtered and monitored. Social media platforms and messaging services have often been blocked or subject to tight regulation. Independent journalism operated at considerable risk, and several high-profile cases of detention and enforced disappearance drew international condemnation. Among these was the case of Boris Shikmurdov, a former foreign minister who fell out of favor with the leadership. Following an alleged assassination attempt against Niyazov in 2002, Shikmurdov appeared in a televised confession in which he denounced himself. Observers noted signs of coercion, and he subsequently disappeared into the prison system. His fate remains unclear, symbolizing broader concerns about due process and transparency. The 2002 assassination attempt marked a pivotal moment. The government described it as a coordinated effort by political opponents and former officials to overthrow the state. However, limited public evidence was released to substantiate the claims. In the aftermath, a sweeping crackdown targeted suspected dissidents and critics. Numerous individuals were detained, and reports of forced confessions circulated. The episode intensified the climate of fear and reinforced the perception that dissent, even perceived dissent, could result in severe consequences. One facility that became emblematic of this era was Ovadan Depe prison, located in the desert outside Ashgabat. Human rights organizations have described it as a high-security detention center associated with harsh conditions, extreme isolation, and limited external oversight. Former detainees and advocacy groups have reported allegations of mistreatment, poor medical care, and prolonged incommunicado detention. The remoteness of the facility contributed to its opacity, and information about those held there has often been scarce. For families of detainees, uncertainty itself became a form of punishment, as they struggled to obtain reliable information about their relatives' status. Control mechanisms also extended to physical mobility. Internal travel could require registration, particularly in the capital. Access to certain jobs or educational institutions was linked to residency documentation. International travel has historically involved bureaucratic hurdles, and reports have described informal blacklists, preventing certain citizens from leaving the country. In this environment, mobility functioned not simply as a logistical matter but as an instrument of governance. The ability to move, to study abroad, or to access foreign networks became contingent upon perceived loyalty. While political restrictions tightened, Ashgabat underwent dramatic architectural transformation. Massive public works projects reshaped the skyline. Government ministries, cultural centers, stadiums, and residential complexes were constructed with uniform white facades. The city's aesthetic coherence projected discipline and unity. However, critics questioned the allocation of resources, particularly given economic volatility linked to fluctuations in global energy markets. Turkmenistan possesses significant natural gas reserves, and revenue from energy exports has underwritten large-scale development projects. Yet economic diversification has remained limited, and reports of currency shortages and rationing have periodically surfaced. In December 2006, Niyazov died unexpectedly. His passing generated speculation that the country might shift toward reform. Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow, a longtime official who had served as health minister and was considered a loyalist, assumed the presidency. Initial gestures suggested limited adjustments, including some renaming reversals and modest policy changes. However, international assessments over subsequent years continue to rank Turkmenistan among the least free countries globally. Political pluralism remained constrained, independent media absent, and civic space restricted. Berdimuhamedow himself developed elements of a personality cult, with widespread portraits and state media praise. In 2022, power formally transitioned to his son, Serdar Berdimuhamedow, reinforcing perceptions of dynastic continuity within an already centralized system. International indices provide quantitative reflections of these patterns. Organizations such as Freedom House and Reporters Without Borders have consistently placed Turkmenistan near the bottom of global rankings for political rights and press freedom. These assessments cite the absence of competitive elections, tight media control, and systemic repression of dissent. While official state narratives emphasize stability, sovereignty, and development, external observers highlight the costs borne by civil liberties. The contrast between Ashgabat's architectural spectacle and the reported constraints on everyday life illustrates a broader theme: the politics of image. Monumental urban design can serve as a visual assertion of order and legitimacy. Wide, empty avenues communicate discipline. Symmetry conveys rational planning. Gleaming facades suggest prosperity. Yet architecture alone cannot capture the full complexity of lived experience. When access to information is restricted and public debate limited, the visible surface becomes both symbol and shield. Turkmenistan's trajectory invites reflection on the relationship between aesthetics and authority. Throughout history, governments have used monumental construction to communicate power. From imperial capitals to modern megaprojects, architecture can project narratives of destiny and permanence. However, when political participation narrows and dissent is curtailed, such symbolism may also function as distraction. The state's emphasis on visible grandeur can overshadow invisible restrictions. At a psychological level, repeated exposure to singular narratives shapes perception. If media channels present only one version of events, alternative interpretations struggle to gain traction. When education systems prioritize officially sanctioned texts, critical inquiry may diminish. Over time, conformity becomes normalized, not necessarily because all citizens agree, but because opportunities to question shrink. In tightly managed environments, silence can be mistaken for consensus. The lesson often drawn from Turkmenistan's experience extends beyond national borders. It concerns the broader vulnerability of critical thought under systems that monopolize information. Authoritarian control may manifest overtly through censorship and coercion, or more subtly through narrative saturation and symbolic dominance. In either case, the capacity to verify claims, access diverse perspectives, and engage in open dialogue remains essential to meaningful freedom. Ashgabat today stands as a city of striking contrasts. Its white marble surfaces reflect sunlight across the desert horizon, embodying a carefully curated national image. At the same time, international observers continue to document structural constraints on political expression and civil liberties. The interplay between spectacle and silence defines much of the country's modern identity. While leadership has changed over time, the underlying architecture of control, legal, informational, and symbolic, has shown remarkable continuity. Ultimately, Turkmenistan's story is not solely about one leader, one city, or one historical moment. It is about the mechanisms through which authority is constructed and maintained. It illustrates how institutions inherited from prior regimes can be repurposed to consolidate power, how public space can be redesigned to reinforce hierarchy, and how information management can shape collective memory. It also underscores the enduring importance of transparency, accountability, and independent thought. Where information flows freely and institutions are open to scrutiny, citizens possess greater capacity to participate meaningfully in public life. Where information narrows and symbolism dominates, perception itself becomes an arena of governance. In examining Turkmenistan, the most enduring insight may be this: physical structures can be built rapidly, but intellectual autonomy requires constant cultivation. Marble facades can project strength, yet resilience ultimately depends on the freedom of individuals to question, analyze, and decide for themselves. Whether in visibly authoritarian systems or in more subtle environments of influence, the preservation of critical inquiry remains central to genuine liberty.